Hi, welcome to Educators for Peace and Justice Alberta March meeting. Of course, I forgot to hit record. All you missed before this video starts is an introduction of Pam Davidson. Pam Davidson is the current superintendent of the Calgary Girls Charter School, a former principal and director of learning at RockyView Schools, and is my personal mentor who I've known for over 10 years. Pam is graciously giving us her time this evening to discuss female empowerment and her vision for female justice in the world and in schools. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the video.
This conversation is so important. And like I said, I am not an expert, but I've observed a lot. But anybody who turned on the radio today would know why it's important to have this conversation. And that's really what it is. We're going to have a little conversation today. We heard about the demonstrations that are going on in Australia against sexual assault because a number of their politicians, male politicians, have been accused of really poor behavior and worse. We hear about the demonstrations that are going on in England because a woman was allegedly murdered by a police officer. There was another article on CBC today about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So, you know, we're sitting here in this very privileged position and able and willing to make a difference in the world. But there are a lot of places where women are not treated appropriately, are not given equal opportunity, do not have equal rights. And at the end of the day, we are worse for that. And it's not just women are worse off, societies are worse off when 50% of the population is not treated appropriately and fairly. So I think it is important that we all do our part, those of us who have the ability to do that. And we'll talk a little bit in this conversation about what that might look like. I was inspired, I've got to say, because she's on this call, by my mom, who was one of those women who worked outside the home when I was a kid. She was a hospital administrator, and she had to tackle a lot of the things that right now we may not consider, where she had to advocate with an all-male board of directors for equal pay for nursing attendants who did the same job as orderlies. And just because they were women, they weren't necessarily going to be treated appropriately. I've seen all kinds of things subtly and overtly where girls and women are not treated fairly, are not given opportunity, are overlooked. And we can't tolerate that. And we have to find ways, especially those of us who are in education, to empower girls and young women. And that's kind of, I think, how I ended up at the Calgary Girls Charter School. So we want to flip to the next slide, Danica. Our school is a girls-only education environment, and it is a place where we provide space for girls at that most influential age to find their voice, to develop a sense of self-confidence, to take risks, to fail forward, to find ways to be activists, to learn about the history of women and understand better how they need to be active and engaged in ensuring that they get to access opportunities that maybe their mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers certainly didn't. And I think, again, we can't take anything for granted. And so it is wonderful when I see the girls at our school and our tremendous staff supporting them. When they speak with confidence. And it has been told to me on a number of occasions that when our students get to high school, because they transition out of grade 9 into grade 10, you can always tell someone who comes from the Calgary Girls Charter School, because they are not cowed when they get into a co-ed setting, because they have been set up so well when they are in the school that taking that next step isn't as fearful. And I also want to share that that was one of those other compelling reasons for me to do this. And Danica and Calby's here, Alexa's here. I used to see too many times in the schools where I was a principal and or a teacher in student leadership, where I would see all these amazing young women who are leaders in our school, in our, safe school. But over time, those wonderful, talented young women didn't necessarily have and or take or create leadership opportunities beyond the school setting. And that's really troubling to me. And research would bear out that when you move out of these educational settings, women do not get the same kinds of leadership opportunities that their male counterparts do. And there's something that's wrong with that, and we've got to tackle that. So I'm inspired by students. I'm inspired by my colleagues. I'm inspired by so many people that I think that's why we do what we do. And that's why it's important for all of us. And it's not just females. I noted that we only have females here. I don't know if there are any males that have joined us, but it's a social and a societal problem. It's not just something that women have to look after themselves. We're at the heart of it, but it's something that has to be everyone's concern. So there's some information from the World Economic Forum that I wanted to share. And this is the other part, is I'm just going to provide us, I've curated some information that's some food for thought for us that maybe we can talk about, because again, people have dedicated their lives to all of this. And I am just an observer and hopefully a facilitator to support women being empowered. But I thought there was some really interesting data here. And, the name of this report, Mind the 100-Year Gap, was just so compelling for me. And this isn't just about developed countries such as ours. It takes into account developing countries. And what was so sad to me is, despite how far we've come, we've still got such a long way to go. And so much so that, the top of the report said neither, not in our generation or our children's generation or their children's generation will we see this gap closing. So that's part of why we need to have this conversation. The gap when it comes to men and women and gender is massive. Go ahead, Danica. And in particular, the areas most challenging are those that we might intuitively be aware of. And that's those economic participation and opportunity that women are afforded versus men, which is very, very short. And then something that is kind of creates a bit of a chicken and the egg, political empowerment is another area where we are absolutely disparate in comparison to where men are. And until those gaps get closed, we are never going to realize some of those opportunities and influence and the equity that we would like to see. Canada, by the way, ranked 19th in the world in terms of overall our gender gap. Number 1 was Iceland, followed by Norway and Finland. So they're doing some things right in terms of empowering 50% of their population. The rest of the world has a ways to go, and Canada is certainly there. So despite all of the gains that we have managed, and we've certainly managed many, we are not there yet. So I've been doing a lot of reading. So I'm just going to share a few resources, because each of these could be a deep dive, and Danica and I talked about rabbit holes. And so the next slide is a book that I read. It's a quick read if anyone's interested. It'll take you a couple hours. But Melinda Gates, of Bill and Melinda Gates. And of course, people who have billions of dollars to spend on making the world a better place and choose to focus that on women's issues, there's a wonderful place in them, in the universe for them when their lives are spent on this earth. But there is, I was surprised by some of the statistics, and everything that they do, by the way, is data driven. When they are putting their money into play, they want to ensure that they're going to get the best return, and they're going to have the greatest impact for their investment in terms of making the world a better place. So I thought this one, in terms of gender discrimination being encoded in law in nearly everywhere in the world, was astonishing to me. But we can see that, in fact, our big brother to the south no US law ensuring paid maternity leave for new mothers. So right out of the gate, women are not going to be treated equitably. And certainly with some of the appointments to the American Supreme Court, there's been some real controversy about how some of the male decision makers could be having profound impact on female lives down the road. So I thought that it's not just about what is encoded in law, it's what isn't included in law that doesn't protect women. So the next slide also talks a little bit about why it's so important, because when women's rights and society's health and wealth are considered, they all rise together. Again, this isn't just a women's issue, it's a societal issue. And all kinds of research says is that when women are supported, when women are educated, when women are empowered, they are able to make a difference, not just to themselves, but they make a difference in their families. They look after their families, they look after their communities. And I shared this particular part around contraception because Melinda's initial focus in one of her early projects was on contraception and access to contraceptives in developing countries. Because one of the anecdotes she shared was going into a community and a mother wanting to give her baby away because it was her, I want to say, 7th or 8th child, and she couldn't feed the first 3. But she had no control over her body, over whether or not she would be having children or not. All of that female health was not looked after. And so Melinda said, you know, she said, I can't compare my life to theirs, but I know as a woman of privilege, a huge part of my success in my own world was my ability to plan pregnancies and shape my career with a timeline that was my own. So when we talk about people in developing countries, it is a human rights issue. It is about living lives that are healthy and robust and fulfilling and not just surviving. And for too many women in the world, it's about survival. It's not about thriving. And it's not just for them, it's for them and their families. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, her book, Moment of Lift, I saw someone, I think it's Michelle, was reading that right now. It's a great book, something that everybody should pick up. And, you know, what are some of the things that we might be able to do? We'll talk about that a little later to support some of those people in developing countries. All right, Danica. So it's not just about an equity challenge, it's also a leadership challenge. So if I flip the conversation a little bit in some of the research around developed countries, we can talk about leadership, women in positions of influence. And there are a few metaphors that are out there in some of the writing that can easily be accessed. And we've heard, many of us have heard about the notion of a glass ceiling. Well, the glass ceiling already implies that someone has ascended to a particular level of achievement, a particular level of influence, a particular level of power, if you will. But there are also all kinds, and it's in Sheryl Sandberg in Lean In talks about a jungle gym. There are a lot of different ways to progress one's career, and it isn't necessarily linear like a ladder or merely up. It might have a very circuitous route, more like a jungle gym where you're hopping here and there, hopping out, hopping back in, having children, coming back into the workforce, taking a different role to garner new skills, to take you in a different direction, to a long lens, get a different position. The other metaphor was around a labyrinth. And that was how, in many cases, a woman might bump into something that forced a change in direction or trajectory. And that could be a lack of opportunity. This is, and they say, the researcher was saying that this happens at all levels. It isn't just for women who have ascended to a particular level of leadership. It's at every single level of a woman's career. There could be an on-ramp or an off-ramp by choice or by default. And so the whole notion of it being a mere glass ceiling isn't necessarily the metaphor that is most appropriate.
So Pam, I'm wondering, what are some barriers and challenges you faced in your career
That is a
or
great
life?
question, Danica. You know, some things are so insidious, you don't realize that it's a barrier. And that's really interesting. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the power of talk, which is a great essay I read from a Harvard Business Review article. But, you know, I'm going to talk about one of the things that many of us have probably heard of, but it's called the Old Boys Club, right? And in one of my previous organizations, it was a literal old boys club, but it was a Scotch club. And a lot of men in leadership positions were in the Scotch Club. And it was impenetrable for women. It was the exclusive purview of men. And there were decisions being made that impacted our entire organization. So knowing that that was impenetrable, and not that I'd want to be in a Scotch club anyway, but I decided with a few of my female friends that we'd start a dinner club slash book club slash let's drink some wine and solve a few world problems club. But it was, okay, we can do our own thing. And so it was a number of women getting together and trying to be generative and positive and look at ways that we could make a difference. That was, you know, one of those things that, you know, maybe isn't so overt in some organizations, but certainly exists. Also overt sexism and bullying. I remember in one of my first jobs when I moved down to Calgary, there was uncomfortable conversation in the staff room. I just quit going to the staff room. I was too young, and I didn't want to tackle that. Now I wouldn't tolerate that, but back then I did. And now I would, and actually I have since, when similar things have surfaced. But when you're older, you might feel a little less worried about what other people think, and you maybe won't tolerate quite so much. The other part was recognition that excellence and hard work doesn't necessarily yield a pathway to a next step or success, because I was a woman. And when I would see, and it wasn't even necessarily for me, it was in circumstances where I saw really talented females overlooked, whose credential, experience, expertise was such, and not recognized, and perhaps a lesser prepared, competent, capable male got the role. And so I think, you know, those are the kinds of things that I've had to deal with. Another one, and which is not uncommon for a lot of women, is the imposter syndrome. And I took a course at the U of C when I first moved down here 20 plus years ago. And it was Prof. Catherine Warren talked about imposter syndrome. And I was reading it going, oh my gosh, that's me. And, you know, overcoming that, thinking, okay, I do have the ability to do this. It's not just because I'm wishful thinking or because someone knows someone or someone's done me a favor. It was on merit that I'd been able to get to some of those positions. So it's overcoming that self-doubt. Also something that had to be, it was something, it's a work in progress every day. Let's just put it that way. It still is. And I think, Danica, you're asking if people can share some ideas. What are some of the things barriers that you've faced in, whether it's equity or leadership? What are some of the barriers people have faced? If you can put them in the chat, then we can get a few more people engaged in the conversation. Oh, awesome. I see structures not in place to support working mothers and motherhood. Absolutely. That's a barrier. And if your partner is not an actual partner, the research would bear that women take on, and that's another part, take the statistics last week that came out from Statistics Canada, and the job loss during the pandemic. Women were inordinately losing employment because of the sacrifices they had to make for family, be it children or aged parents. But women were stepping out, taking time off, or removing themselves entirely from the workforce to take look after those around them. Other things, global topic right now, feeling unsafe walking at night or alone. That's not something that men typically worry about, but for women, that's always an issue. Sexism in the staff room and it being tolerated. And, you know, it takes courage to call that out when you're in that space. Inequitable pay for the same work. Well, and that's absolutely true. When we're in a union, I guess we have a little bit of protection there, but too often women being remunerated at a lower level for exactly the same work, and sometimes doing more than, with more background and credential. Being told I have to be the soft place to land because of the nature of my male counterparts. Wow. Okay, see, that is back to that default socialization, making that an expectation of a female because she's female. And so does that give a pass to the men? And you know what? I don't want to put men into just a simple box, because I've worked with some wonderful men who are committed to ensuring that they do all they can to be sensitive to and a party to and a partner with females and women, and who want to raise boys and want to raise their girls to be empowered and respectful and contributing. So there are a lot of barriers there. Now we've got a lot, we've got another one here in terms of diagnoses and people not recognizing in a girl what they would probably very quickly recognize in a boy. So, you know, where does it start? Where does this socialization start? And in a couple of the resources I'm going to share with you, if you read them, it will be aha. You're going to have some aha moments. All right, just so I can keep going, we'll come back to some of these. I know Danica's moderating and we'll have lots to talk about after. But I wanted to talk about the Heidi and Howard case study. And this was jarring for me, like jaw-dropping jarring. And it's in Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. And I did start buying this, Danica. I don't know if I bought this for you as a graduation present, but from high school. You're still in university, just finishing up, by the way, on the sub list for Calgary Board of Education. Yay. Anyway, Sheryl Sandberg, who is the chief operating officer for Facebook. So a woman in a tech role, but she shared a case study about success and likability. And it was done by professors from Columbia and New York University. And it was based on a Harvard Business School case study, which I thought, okay, so we're not talking small fry here. We're talking, you know, accomplished people who are undertaking this study. And the case study was based on real life entrepreneur Heidi Rosen. And the case described how she became a successful venture capitalist by using her outgoing personality and vast personal and professional network that included many of the most powerful business leaders in the tech sector. So these professors assigned half the students to read Heidi's story and gave the other half the exact same story with just one difference. They changed the name to Howard. Professors Flynn and Anderson then polled the students about their impressions of Heidi or Howard, and the students rated Heidi and Howard as equally competent, which made sense since their accomplishments were completely identical. Yet, while students respected both Heidi and Howard, Howard came across as a more appealing colleague. Heidi, on the other hand, was seen as selfish and not the type of person you'd want to work for or hire. The same data with a single difference, gender, created vastly different impressions. And there's the catch. So as it says here, the conclusion is that success and likability are positively correlated for men and negatively for women. We can think back to a certain election about some odd years ago, where a stellar female and well-accomplished high-achieving female candidate was not likable, with all kinds of criticisms, regardless of how high-achieving she was. But this catches women, because women are socialized to want to be liked. And so if one is trying to make a difference in a leadership role, there can be some real tension and dissonance in one trying to ascend to a level of leadership, knowing that the sacrifice could be likability. And you know what? It's not just men who don't like women who are in leadership roles. And I'm going to share one little story with you. It was one of the schools where I was a principal, and I had a reasonably new male assistant principal. He's a great guy. he's a principal now, and he phoned me last week. He was asking about some of the work we were doing at the Calgary Girls Charter School. He and I still remain in touch. And I told him I was going to be doing this. And he said, you know, I can't forget. He worked for a male principal, and he said, I saw how men and women treated him versus treated you. And he got a pass. And it's not that that gentleman isn't a great guy, but there it was from someone who could be that objective observer and see, even here in, you know, late 20 or early 21st century, the Heidi and Howard case study still rings true. So that's something that's a little disappointing, but something that we're going to continue to work on. There's another report that comes from Hewlett Packard, and it talks about, and this also came from Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. And this is something, and I'm going to ask women, I'm going to ask people in the chat if you've ever done this. Women will apply for open jobs if they think they meet 100% of the criteria listed. Whereas men in the same circumstance, at 60%, they're ready to take the risk. They're ready to throw their names in the arena. And by taking that next, or they call it that stretch move, the stretch position, they get more exposure, they get training. So I want people to think about, have you ever held yourself back from maybe a stretch move because you thought, oh, I couldn't possibly do that because you weren't feeling 100% ready? So I'm wondering if that does ring true for anybody here. I see some people saying yes. And, you know, again, this is no slight on the men. In fact, I'm like, hurrah, go for it. You know, we need, as I think, women to be encouraged to take greater risks, because that's how you learn. And it's also that whole notion of maybe being afraid to fail. There's that good girl syndrome and, you know, that pursuit of perfection. So we are less willing to take risks when it comes to some of those stretch moves. All right, I'm seeing a lot of affirmation there, right? I've been convinced to apply later. Absolutely, yeah. The IT world's rife with sexism, absolutely. Last bastion of males being intimidated by successful women, totally. And we've got, you know, I guess just too many examples of this. And again, this is why it's not just a women's problem. It's a societal problem, because until we're all aware of it and taking steps to, whether you are a parent of a daughter and you don't want that for your daughter, or you're in a professional role, or you want to try and make a difference for girls and young women around the world, there are things that we have to do and things we have to talk about, like tonight. There's a wonderful TED Talk that I want to recommend you view. It's only about 16 minutes, but this was really interesting. And the principal in our school is a principal, wonderful, strong female leader, and not just a female leader. I would say she can hold her own in any group, and she's had to, and I'm so proud of her for that. She has an 8-year-old son and twin girls who are 6. And I was talking to her, I recommended this video to her, and she said, oh my gosh, I've done that. She totally did it. She had her son on a wakeboard when he was 4, and her daughters are 6, and she said, not a chance. So she said, I totally treat them differently. And this is coming from a strong woman who knows it. So she is, again, now that she knows, she said, I can't unknow. So she's going to do something about it. So this is definitely a little video that I would encourage you to view. But she talked about children who are encouraged to play on a fireman's pole. She was a fireman, by the way, a firefighter. And she said, around the playground, if you watch how boys are encouraged to play versus how girls are encouraged to play, there's a lot more assistance and direction provided to girls. There's a lot more encouragement and risk-taking advocated for boys. And right out of the gate, that notion that we talked about in the stretch move, that's a socialized behavior where little guys right out of the from very early age are encouraged to make their way. Well, what happens? They're developing a huge skill set around resilience, around understanding one's boundaries around garnering and insights into yourself and where you need to grow. So that's just, again, a little bit of food for thought for you in terms of some more information. So this is available on the web. I just sent it to my secretary treasurer. And this is one of those things where we've heard of the term mansplaining. That might be a little irksome for some of us, but it's not just men. There's an understanding in the way we communicate. And it's, again, something that is socialized from childhood. So this is not blaming this on men or women, it's socialization. And so until we are aware of it, we can change behaviors. We're probably going to end up with some challenges. So there's in this article, which is, it was written in 1995, and she worked for years in doing research in workplaces to see how women and men communicate. And there is, because of a lot of dynamics, that notion of what she calls one up and one down. Because of the communal nature of women, wanting everyone to feel well and safe and together, they will often defer. And in the next slide, if you can see, it talks about a number of different ways. If you could just flip that, a number of different ways that the ways women communicate can backfire, because they like to communally often share credit using the word we instead of I, downplaying their strengths because to play them up can seem boastful and they can be judged. Asking questions is so important. And I shared with Danica, one of the things in terms of straight talk, I will say, and I said when I became a new principal about 100 years ago, I didn't know what I was doing. Well, I probably did, but I didn't feel like I did. But I wanted to ask questions for clarification to ensure I was doing things correctly versus faking it till I made it. And that whole idea of, I will remember this vividly. It was with the director of finance and I was working on my school budget. And I asked a question and help me to understand. His name was Bob. Well, next thing I know, it was being shared with the whole jurisdiction because I was the only one who stepped up to answer it, but they saw that error being created in budgets across the jurisdiction. So, but asking questions can be perceived as lack of competence, weakness. You don't have the background to do your job. The notion of apologizing to try and make people feel better and keep the peace. Giving feedback is done in very different ways between men and women. And not because it's right or wrong, it's just different. But if you're playing by women's rules versus what is sort of the code, they talk about writing the code of men, you can put yourself in a disadvantageous position. Avoiding verbal opposition, managing up being indirect. This, I'll recommend this book. I know I saw someone talk about references and I do have them at the end of the PowerPoint. This has a whole pile of articles that are all Harvard Business Review curated. Wonderful. And the article on the power of talk is in there. So that whole notion of communal conversation versus one up. And there's men are socialized for that power dynamic of the one up, and women are socialized to the one down to keep the peace. And women are much more likely to downplay their strengths. And men are much more likely to minimize their doubts because they don't want to expose that authentic self. So that's really important. So I would highly recommend that, easily accessible on the web too, digitally. So one of the words that we use in our school community is intentionality. We are trying to be very intentional about what we do, what we say, how we say it. We talk about leading by design and not by default. And I think when we're talking about women's empowerment, if we want what's best for our daughters, for our students, for ourselves, for our colleagues, we have to be intentional about what it is we're doing and how we're inhabiting the world. We have to think about how we can be supportive of one another. We have to think about how we can be champions in small or large ways. And I think that this is something that all of us can think about, is in our own circle of influence. We might have a large circle of concern, but we certainly all have our own circle or circles of influence. And there are things that we can do. We can educate ourselves and we can educate each other. We can advocate, we can speak up, we can articulate some of the things we're learning tonight and start a conversation with someone else who may not be privy to some of this research that we're, throwing into this conversation. We can take action in small or large ways. My family knows that I've been trying for years. At Christmas, I make donations, overseas donations for girls' education, because I know that that's a difference maker. I make donations overseas for women's hygiene products and women's health training, because those can be barriers to them getting opportunities that are going to better their lives, the lives of their children, the lives of their communities. And I think the other piece that we have to also remember to do, and that all of us can do, is to celebrate. Too often, when women do things well, it doesn't get the same kind of acknowledgement or airplay as perhaps others receive. And I remember, and I saw someone in a conversation here, there are so many wonderful things that go on in the world that need to be celebrated. And particularly, we look at the life we're living right now, which is just a little strange, to say the least. But man, people have stepped up. Women have stepped up. Men have stepped up. And we just have to be mindful of, when we see, as Statistics Canada shared last week, that women have been inordinately hit by job loss, what can we do to support them? If we want what's best for students, for girls, for daughters, for humanity, it's a social issue for men and women. So what can we do? I've got a few specific things. This conversation. So thank you, Danica Dirksen, and your partners in crime here, because this is the start of it. Elevate the conversation around women's empowerment. Clearly, as we said at the outset of this, we have not arrived. We've still got a lot of work to do. Learn, read, become informed, share that. And it's not just here, certainly here, but maybe further afield as well. And this is something that my mother said to me when I was a kid. She talked about making sure you stay connected with your female friends, because there is, we talk about a sisterhood. Despite the wonderful men in our lives, for those of us who do have men in our lives, there is still something about your female friends that can support and inspire you in difficult times. And then the other component, those of us who are in the profession, and certainly as educators, I say this to the leaders that I speak with, but I say this to everyone: ensure that you have a robust professional learning network, because you garner great ideas from people who are coming at the work from different perspectives. And that's something that you have to be intentional about. It's easy, and I've come to learn, because I work in a public charter school, which is a sort of a small ecosystem. I came from a much larger system, and I can see, wow, we've got a lot of work to do to help bring in different perspectives, expand the network, if you will. And that can also be done through mentoring. If you have the ability or opportunity, if you're in a position to mentor others, wonderful. If you want to grow, seek out an authentic mentor who can help you grow. Work on paying it forward. Again, I think my personal and professional credo is I do my best to help others do their best. Mentoring is a wonderful way to do that. And you have to advocate for yourself when you're put into difficult positions. I've had that. I've had very difficult work positions, and I had to steel myself and have a difficult conversation with a male supervisor who was not behaving as well as I think he probably could have and should have. It yielded an apology, but didn't ultimately yield long-term change in behavior. But you have to advocate for yourself. And if you see others who need support, advocate for them, which means challenging injustices, both here and afar.
So Pam, who are some of your mentor and role models in your sphere of influence in life that you've had?
Well, one of them is here right now. It's my mother, Shirley. She, unbeknownst to her, you know, who knows? Again, it's that overt and subtle things. I remember the International Year of the Woman, and she gave me these stickers. Pardon me. And they were red and white with the International Year of the Woman and the symbol. I had them plastered all over my binder as a grade 5 student. My poor teachers, like, they must have thought what, but my mom didn't care. She let me be me, right? And my sister, who's also on the call, also a mentor, you know, I could wear her stupid hat because it was just what I wanted to do. So encouraging me to be myself, encouraging me to make sure I could earn a living and support a family on my own if ever, when I grew up. She told me that when I was in grade 11, and I never forgot it. So that I would never have to be in a position, you know, all things going well, but I'd never have to be in a position where I might not be able to thrive as a female. I also had some professional mentors, Susan Page in RockyView, Nancy Adams in RockyView, Carol Grant Watt, who's head of school at Strathcona Tweedsmuir, which is a private school now. I'm also going to say role models. And Danica, I'm not blowing smoke up your butt, but when I see, and Calby, I know you're on here, and I know a number of my other students were, but I can only see 3 people on this screen. My students, I saw in them as young women, I saw in you as young women doing great things, and that's inspiring. So was it role modeling? No, but it also made me, who's an old fart, know that when young women have the ability to do good things, those of us who are older can be inspired and shouldn't be so afraid. So I've had some tremendous mentors and role models in my day, and I think we stand, that's okay, you can flip to that next slide. We stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. And, you know, that's it. Every day we just want to make this day better than yesterday. And hopefully tomorrow will be better than that. So Sheryl Sandberg talked about this. Women are increasingly willing to speak up. And when more women get into positions of power, they can do more. So I think this was a really salient quote, because she is a COO of Facebook, but she said she realized in her earlier career she wasn't treating women equitably. And you know, she had to look in the mirror, and I think we all have to continue to look in the mirror to say, are we doing our best to support and encourage others? Go ahead. The other thing I want to talk about was in 2017, it was a burst onto the scene of the Me Too movement, but it was really Tarana Burke. We don't want to forget, it was, you know, years ago. She started a movement, and it was empowerment through empathy. That is a woman's way, more so a more feminine way. It doesn't have to be exclusive domain of women or females, but talking about empowering through empathy. And of course, when the bad behaviors of men in positions of power was called out and people realized it wasn't just them, they found the strength and the courage to say more. And it's only a matter of time before the 50% of the population says, look at enough is enough. Again, today, Danica and I were talking about it. There's a girl in Leduc who was murdered by, it sounds like a boyfriend. Too many times women are not protected. And I don't mean protected as in they're weak, but as in the law, the way people view men and women in relationships does not give them an even playing field. And I just thought of, there are so many people we can celebrate. You know, we've got artists and poets and musicians and politicians and lawmakers and scientists and philanthropists and doctors and lawyers and so many people, business people who are making a difference. And again, it's not just a women's issue. This is something that men and women together can make the world a better place, not just for women, but for the entire of society. And once, we'll do the next slide, you know better, you do better. And that's why engaging in conversations like we are tonight, and talking to your friends, your family, those people who are in positions of influence, who can advocate and facilitate to make a difference, can. And once we know better, we do better. And I've said one of the things that is really important is you can't unknow what you know. So once some of these things have been surfaced and brought to light, that's something that you have to make sure that you pay attention to. And then how you respond to that in the world is going to make a difference for girls and women. So that's kind of a lot of talk for me, and you can tell I need to stop because I need to have a drink. So I don't know.
Thanks a ton, Pam. That was so insightful. I know we talk a lot about this, but I think it's so interesting even to hear your experience along with the statistics and the stories and whatnot, and just how I think when women do speak up, and there's power in numbers, and when we can all band together and talk about it and name it and call it out, I think there's change that can happen from that. Even in your own sphere of influence, you don't need to be a Greta Thunberg and a Malala to make a difference in your community. You need to be one person, one voice in your world, and in your friend group, and in your school, and in your classroom, and that's all that matters. So that's awesome. If you have any questions